Welcome to episode 30 of the MMA Rundown podcast. There was no UFC event this weekend, but we still have a lot of really good events in combat sports. I'm not really going to cover the Deontay Wilder fight too much just because it wasn't a fight I watched. So he did win by knockout. I saw the highlight of that, but I just don't feel like there's a whole lot for me to add on top of it. But that was a big combat sports event that happened. But there was plenty of other interesting stuff that happened throughout the week. So we had Ben Askren retiring from both MMA, and then it sounds like he may also be retiring just from competitive athletics too. So I'll talk about what he was saying in his retirement interview. We have Bo Nickal versus Gordon Ryan being scheduled for December 7th. Really interesting match between an elite world champion wrestler and an elite world champion Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy. Granted, the U23 isn't the same as winning senior worlds, but still very high-level wrestler that Bo Nickal is. We have the Spyder Invitational, which was a $100,000 tournament that put together two really strong brackets out in Korea on Saturdays. So I'll recap that event. We have Jon Jones finally getting his next opponent. It's Dominick Reyes. That fight is scheduled for UFC 247. After that, we'll talk about Penn State, who had a 60-match win streak in wrestling that was just ended by Arizona State by a score of 19-18. So I'll recap that duel meet. Another college wrestling story to talk about on top of that will be Iowa versus Iowa State. That duel just finished up. Iowa getting the win there, a much more dominant duel for them than what happened last year. And this, of course, was in Ames where they were able to pick up that dominant win. I'll recap the Garry Tonon versus Davi Ramos fight to win main event that happened overnight. And then a couple other things to talk about will be video of a fight that happened back in 2017 that was just brought up this week by Mike Brown, the head coach at American Top Team. So just recap what happened there. And then talk about how that story is developed and also what can be learned from that moving forward into other fights. And then the final topic to talk about will be a weird little incident that happened at a BJJ Fanatics tournament that happened last week. I actually could have talked about it last week, and it's just one of those things where when I was watching it, they didn't have a replay of the punch that happened, so I didn't really notice it at the time. But then I saw the replays and feel like it's probably a topic worth talking about as punches being thrown in a jiu-jitsu match and no DQ being given. So we'll start at the top with Ben Askren retiring. And in his retirement speech, I think a lot of people were not surprised that he retired after the loss to Damian Maia just because he was saying that his goal in the UFC was just to try to become a champion, and that was really it for him. He didn't want to be just another guy who was ranked in the top 15. It was either champion or bust, and if he felt like it was going to be too much work to get back to the title, he wasn't going to do it. So that was a story that we all knew. What we didn't know is that he had a really bad hip issue, and that ended up pressuring him into retiring right now. And this hip issue is going to be handled by him getting a hip replacement in the middle of his 30s, which is really early for someone to be getting one of those. And in the interview he had with Helwani, not only did he say that this hip replacement was going to take him out of MMA, but he also said that prior to the retirement, he was thinking about doing a lot of grappling matches in the future after he retired from MMA. So that'd be matches kind of like what he had with Jordan Burroughs, where he was competing at Beat the Streets. He was also talking prior to getting signed by the UFC. He was talking about competing in a really big college wrestling tournament called the Midlands, which is an open tournament that anyone can really sign up for. So even though he hasn't wrestled in college for years, in theory he could sign up for that tournament. It's just for the most part the people who sign up for that tournament tend to be college wrestlers. So there was interest there about him going into a college tournament, seeing how he would do against some of the better guys. So it seems like that's off the table now, which is a bit unfortunate. But then also on the jiu-jitsu angle of it, he was talking about how he wanted to take some jiu-jitsu matches as well after he was done. Dylan Dennis being one of the main guys that he was looking at, and that also seems to be off the table. So he's gonna have to get the surgery. With a guy like him, he's gonna be in a wrestling room regardless because he's still coaching. So for him, he seems like the kind of guy where even if right now he doesn't intend to get back into competing, he's probably gonna slowly be dipping his toes back in, and he'll go from just coaching on the side to drilling. Maybe even taking some live rounds in the room, and who knows, maybe he will eventually get back to a point where he does want to compete, even with the hip replacement. But at this moment right now, it doesn't sound like that's something that's going to happen. And so, in a way, it makes this news of his retirement even more depressing than it otherwise was because it was nice to have him in the UFC. Not only was it interesting to watch his fight because he had a really unique style, in that he was so heavily based in wrestling, and then also had a really unique way of mixing folk style wrestling with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to sort of like have a really controlling top game and oftentimes find holes for him to be able to throw punches, be able to take his opponent's back. It seemed as though towards the end of his career he was starting to find more submissions than he had been earlier on. So there was a lot that was interesting about him just in the octagon, but even outside the octagon, very entertaining guy. Definitely put himself out there. Was one of those guys who understood that when you put yourself out there, yeah, it kind of sucks. They're gonna have some people talk shit to you if you fail, but if you succeed, you succeed really fast and you succeed really far. And for him to come into the UFC, having fought in Bellator, having fought halfway across the globe, and putting himself in a position after beating Robbie Lawler where he could have been one fight away if he had beaten Jorge Masvidal from getting a title fight. I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from how he handled his career that I would hope to see other fighters learn from and sort of take up. I'd say continue the momentum that he started there. So I'd say that would probably cover it for Ben Askren right now. At this point, hopefully he gets the surgery soon. Hopefully everything goes well with it, and then maybe in a year from now, or maybe even longer than that, he starts to get the itch again and actually does come back to compete in some grappling tournaments, whether that's jiu-jitsu or whether that's wrestling. But I think at this point, it seems like he's just going to be resigned to coaching and handling some of his other business, which I'm sure he'll keep him busy and I'm sure he'll be happy with it. But it's a shame if this is the last time that he competes in an athletic competition. Next topic to talk about is Bo Nickal versus Gordon Ryan. So we were just talking about a possible match between Ben Askren and Dylan Dance, where you have a high-level wrestler going up against a high-level jiu-jitsu guy in a jiu-jitsu match. Well, in this case, we're actually getting that, a high-level wrestler going up against a high-level jiu-jitsu guy. With Bo Nickal, he's a three-time NCAA champion at Penn State, won 2 titles at 184 pounds, and then most recently won last year at 197 pounds. In addition to that, he also won a Hodge Trophy, which is it's explained as like the Heisman of wrestling, but effectively what it is, it's the most dominant wrestler of the year, and that they don't give it out per weight class. So it's not like there's 10 Hodges, there's one Hodge. So you'll have 10 national champions every year, but only one of them's gonna end up winning the Hodge Trophy, and Bo Nickal was able to do that. So that kind of shows where he's at. Not only is he an elite wrestler, not only does he win most of his matches, but he's able to win in dominant fashion, which is what that Hodge Trophy really represents. But then I think it was a couple months ago, maybe even just 1 month ago, though he wasn't able to make the senior level world team for the United States, unfortunately because he ran into Jaden Cox, who was a 3-time world champion, and in wrestling they only allow one person per country, so Bo Nickal kind of a bit of a victim in that way that he was born on the same patch of soil that Jaden Cox was. But either way, he was able to make the U23 team. Jaden Cox is older than 23, so he wasn't fighting for it anyway. Not that he really would have wanted to go for it because he already had the senior team locked up. But Bo Nickal went to the World Championships there and was able to win a world title. So Bo is at a very high level in wrestling. His plan right now is to continue to wrestle throughout the next year and make a run at the Olympic team for the U.S. Again, unfortunately, he's in a position where he's going to have to beat a world champion to make the team. And if he doesn't, that's unfortunate, but it seems as though that's kind of expected that he won't. And if that happens, then it's very likely that he's going to shift all of his focus into MMA. He recently announced that he was going to be opening up an American top team out in State College. I talked a lot about that on last week's podcast, so I'll kind of leave most of that there. But as far as this match goes, it's really interesting in that we're going to get to see an elite wrestler versus the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy in the world right now, in Gordon Ryan. And what's really interesting about this is that typically you would expect if it's wrestling versus Jiu-Jitsu, it's usually the smaller Jiu-Jitsu guy going against the bigger wrestler. In this case, Bo Nickal is actually smaller than Gordon Ryan, which I think is kind of unique. Now, as far as the rule set is concerned, there are 3 main rules that were attached to it. So the first rule is no leg locks, which in a way, obviously, it helps Bo Nickal not to have to worry about leg locks. Most times when wrestlers come into jiu-jitsu, the 2 areas where they get caught the most are either in chokes or leg locks. So taking the leg locks out of the equation is definitely going to help them. With that being said, leg lock positions can still be used for position or for sweeping. If you actually watch the Spyder event, and I'll talk about this in the next topic, Rodolfo Vieira, who recently made his UFC debut, went back in and fought against the current black belt world champion Kaynan Duarte, and Kaynan was able to sweep him by entering into a leg lock position effectively. It's at the gym I train at, we call it the reap sweep, just because it kind of has there's like a knee reap on it, although it's technically allowed if you're not attacking the leg that you reap. But that same sweep could be used in theory by Gordon Ryan against Bo Nickal, and that would still be okay. It's just he can't actually attack the leg with it, but he can still use it to sweep. So that still is on the table for Gordon Ryan. Looking at the other rules, one of the other rules is no guard pulling. Now, what no guard pulling means is very up in the air to me. I'm not exactly sure what they're trying to say about that. If it means that the second that Gordon Ryan pulls guard, they're going to give up 2 points, or he's going to give up 2 points, so it's not as though guard pulling just nullifies it. If he pulls guard, they stand him back up. That's not completely clear. Also, what what constitutes a guard pull to them. If Gordon Ryan shoots in on a single leg, for example, hangs on to Bo's leg for about 3 seconds and then plops his butt down, technically that's not a guard pull under ADCC rules. Is that allowed in this tournament or in this match? I don't know. And then also, let's just say that Bo Nickal grabs a hold of Gordon Ryan and isn't in a position where he would normally be able to finish a takedown, and Gordon just kind of plops down and just gives up the two. Is that going to be 2 points for a takedown? Or are they going to call that a guard pull and stand it back up? So I think there's more that has to be explained there. But that definitely makes things interesting. There are some people who think that, given the no guard pulling rule, that Bo Nickal can just stall for 14 and a half minutes to get a takedown late and then just hang on. If this is score like most jiu-jitsu matches, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Bo will be called for stalling if he stalls. Also, typically with most matches, once the fight hits the ground, if the guy on top starts backing away, they get called for passivity. So I'm sure Gordon Ryan's going to find a way to get this fight to the mat pretty quickly. Whether he has to pretend to be taken down or whether he just gives up 2 points by pulling guard. And then from there, he should have more than enough time to work and be able to get a finish. And then the other rule that they had announced was no tech falls, but there never really have been tech falls in jiu-jitsu, so that's not really that important of a rule to have in there. But either way, very interesting match. I know Chael Sonnen had a bit of a take on it that rubbed the promoter of Third Coast Grappling the wrong way, where he was saying that it's a bad sign for grappling as a sport if you're bringing someone in there going by modified rules. I don't necessarily agree with his argument. I understand the argument that he's making, but that argument would make more sense if Bo Nickal is going into like a competitive architecture like the IBJJF or ADCC, where you have like a tournament in place. Like if they were to say, okay, we're going to put Bo Nickal in the IBJJF Black Belt World Championship bracket, but every match that he's in follows these rules, that would be an issue. But this event is effectively an event that sort of like mixes matches where in some cases they're putting little tournaments together, and in that case then you actually have a competitive architecture, but in other cases it's just super fights that are just there for entertainment. And whether Gordon Ryan was fighting Herbert Santos according to the regular rules, whether he was fighting Rodolfo Vieira according to the regular rules, or if he is fighting Bo Nickal under these modified rules, to me it really doesn't make a big difference either way. So I don't really have any issue with them making the modified rules if that's what it takes to put the match together. And it's definitely a match that a lot of people, myself included, want to see. So no issues there. Next thing to talk about is the Spyder Invitational. There were two brackets here, one at 100 kilograms, one at 76 kilograms. I'll recap the 100 kilogram bracket first. A lot of interesting matches. So on the left half of the bracket, or at least how it was drawn up, you had Nicholas Marigali versus Tim Spriggs. Marigali ends up getting a win here. Goes for an omoplata attempt, comes up on top, and then is able to take the back and get a modified bow and arrow choke to beat Tim Spriggs. Then you have Claudio Calasanz versus Herbert Santos. Score was 0-0. Calasanz goes for a toe hold with about 30 seconds left, trying to at least do enough to win the match in the judges' eyes. But while he was going for his toe hold, Herbert went for a toe hold of his own and ended up catching it and getting the win. So Herbert then moved on to the finals. So then we had a match between Herbert and Marigali on that half of the bracket to earn a spot in the finals. It was pretty competitive. Both the guys had swept each other. Herbert goes for an omoplata, and then while he's in an omoplata, then while he has his legs wrapped around Marigali's shoulder, starts attacking another toe hold. Marigali escapes the toe hold, and at that point, it's not clear what exactly made Herbert upset, but Herbert just effectively decided to quit on the match at that point. So Marigali ends up on top. Is just in side control. The two are talking to each other. Eventually, the ref gives them both warnings for talking, and they continue on. Marigali gets an easy Americana that Herbert wasn't defending, and that's the end of the match, so it puts Marigali in the finals. And the other half of the bracket, you had Kynan going up against Leandro Lowe. Very close match. Kynan gets an advantage. So he was on top. Lowe initiated a sweep, and as he was coming up, Kynan attempted a guillotine before eventually coming back up to his feet. And they didn't give any advantage to Lowe for the sweep attempt, but they did give an advantage to Kynan for the guillotine attempt. So he ends up winning by a score of 1-0. And then we had Rodolfo Vieira making his return to the gi, going up against Anderson Muniz, who was a double gold winner at Purple Belt at Worlds. Recently got his brown belt, but is at a level that is much higher than what his belt indicates. Has beaten a lot of high-level black belts just to earn a spot in this tournament. I was giving Rodolfo some trouble. About halfway through the match, was able to sweep Rodolfo. But later on in the match, Rodolfo was able to pass Anderson's guard. So he had a 3-2 score with about 30 seconds left. Anderson knows that he's got to do something to try to score points and come back. So even though he wasn't in the position to initiate a sweep, he just tried to force it and ended up getting his guard passed and Was quickly arm triangled by Rodolfo. So very, very close match. Even though the final score might not indicate it, it was a very close match. So then that means you get Rodolfo Vera versus Kaynan Duarte in the semifinal. And like I mentioned before, this match ended up being a 2-0 match. Kaynan started on bottom, was able to get that reap sweep I was talking about, comes up on top, and then Rodolfo was unable to sweep Kaynan back. So 2-0 win for Kaynan. They go to the finals. You have Kaynan versus Marigali. Very close match. Marigali was on bottom for the majority of it. Marigali had, I'd say, about 3 different times when he had sat, or at least he had forced Kainan's hip to the mat, but Kaynan would quickly recover, and it would never be super close to getting a sweep, so there were no advantages given. Kaynan had one attempt where he was very close on a pass. Marigali ends up like trying to come up on a double leg to recover his guard and not give up the passing points. Kaynan attempts a standing guillotine, isn't all that close to it. So no advantage is given there. But apparently the ref felt as though Kainan's near pass was closer than the near sweep attempts from Marigali, and so Kaynan ends up winning that match there on ref's decision. In the 76 kilogram bracket, we had I'm trying to think. It was Jonathan Alves versus Shane Jamil Hill Taylor was the first match. Alves off of a double guard pull was quickly able to again do like a Berimbolo type of position, ends up taking Taylor's back, and then chokes him about a minute in with a rear naked choke. So excellent performance from him right there. Then we had Edwin Najmi versus Mateus Gabriel. This was a match that in a lot of ways was similar to a lot of other matches in this bracket where oftentimes with the smaller guys in these gi tournaments, it's a matter of who pulls guard first because whoever's on bottom typically is going to be able to sweep the guy on top. So if you can get on bottom first, then that means it'll be like 2-0 you, 2-2, 4-2 you, 4-4. So you're always in a position where you either are winning or tied. And Gabriel was able to get on bottom first here, so he scores first. This match ends up being a 4-2 win for Mateus Gabriel. Then on the other side of the bracket, we have a really interesting match and one that I'm still not quite sure I agree with the scoring on. But it was Gabriel Argis versus the guy who ended up winning, and Levi Jones-Leary. They both have a double guard pull at the start of the match. Then Levi ends up trying to time a double guard pull again, but it looks as though Gabriel Argis beat him to the ground, and then Levi was still kind of up when Gabriel's butt was on the ground. So then Argis comes up, and Argis, instead of getting 2 points for a sweep, gets an advantage. Eventually, Levi's able to get that advantage back with an ankle lock attempt. They end up going to a ref's decision where it was one advantage each, but Levi was attacking for most of the match off his back, so he ends up getting the win there. And then you have Mateus Lutis versus a local guy by the name of Inasong, and Lutis gets a quick takedown about 10 seconds into the match. Was aggressively attempting to pass for most of the match, wasn't able to do so, but still wins by a score of 2-0. So then you have Levi Jones-Leary versus Mateus Lutis. Levi pulls guard, is able to hit a Berimbolo, so gets 2 points for the sweep, gets 4 points for back control, isn't able to finish, but still gets the win there. So then in the finals you have Levi versus Mateus Gabriel. This fight almost ends in a double DQ with both guys double guard pulling and then no one coming up. So that happened 3 straight times. They double pulled again on the 4th time. Thankfully, Gabriel came up, so he got the advantage there. But then, as I mentioned before, this was one of those matches where whoever starts on bottom typically ends up in a better spot. Levi, by not coming up, ends up on bottom and ends up outscoring Gabriel here and gets the win. So your 2 winners are Kaynan Duarte and Levi Jones-Leary. Next topic to talk about is back to MMA. So we have Jon Jones versus Dominick Reyes. This match was finally announced. In a handful of my previous podcasts, I was talking about how after the win over Chris Weidman, I felt like Reyes was in the best position to get a title shot. The other people who would have arguments would be Corey Anderson. And then I guess you could say Jan Blachowicz, but Blachowicz has a loss to Anderson. Blachowicz was in a bit of a decent spot when he had that fight against Thiago Santos, but Santos was able to knock him out, and Santos ends up taking the title fight from there. So even though Blachowicz has a couple of really big wins against some elite middleweights with Luke Rockhold and Jacare, the fact that fight was as boring as it was, I'm sure it didn't help him anyway. So Reyes ends up winning the sweepstakes. This match will be scheduled for February 8th. As far as how I think it's going to go, it's interesting that Reyes has the length that he does because it's going to make it a little bit more difficult for Jones to kind of fight at range, but I still would imagine that Jon Jones is going to be effective on the feet. That his leg kicks are going to be as effective as they always have been. Will he take Reyes down? I think it's possible. I don't know what sort of takedowns he's going to attempt. I don't know if that he really wants to like back Reyes up against the fence, kind of like dig his head into his hip and go for a takedown there and risk getting caught with some big elbows. But if this fight ends up having to be like the Santos fight, I'm sure Jones will be willing to fight it that way and just winning with leg kicks and winning with one or two punches at a time on the feet, just keeping his range. But it will be a little bit more difficult for him to do that with a guy like Reyes, but I still think that he's got the skill set to do it. So I would pick Jon Jones here. But it'll be interesting to see. Again, there's a few more months before this fight happens, but there are a handful of different ways this fight can go. I'd still have to imagine Jones is getting it, though. Next topic is in NCAA wrestling. So we had a meet between Arizona State and Penn State, and it was expected that Penn State, as they had done in the last 60 wrestling dual meets, would win this. Penn State, I believe, has won 8 out of the last 9 NCAA wrestling titles, so no one really seemed to expect anything different out of them, and that's not how it worked out. So, as most wrestling dual meets go, there's going to be 10 matches. Now, in this one was a little bit odd, is that Penn State forfeited one of the matches. Now, granted, the match that they forfeited was against the number 1 guy in the country, so you could possibly make an argument that had Penn State put someone out there at that weight, maybe the number 1 guy still gets a pin there and nothing really changes, but not having put anyone out there definitely gives Penn State a bit of an excuse there, I could say. But just running through the results, at 125 pounds, Brody Teske ends up falling to Brandon Courtney by major decision. Roman Bravo Young gets a decision win for Penn State. Nickal with a tech fall for Penn State. So starting off decent for Penn State. Granted, you'd like to see Teske to get a big win here against a guy who's on the bottom of the top 20, but wasn't able to do so. But then Josh Maruka gets a decision over Jerry Verclaren. Ja'Cory Teamer gets a decision over Bo Pfeiffer. Then Penn State, with a couple of their national champions, get a couple quick wins. So Vincenzo Joseph gets a win over Josh Shields. Mark Hall gets a major decision over Anthony Valencia. But then this meet kind of goes haywire for Penn State, starting at 184. Why they didn't put anyone out there, I'm not entirely sure. They had 2 guys who potentially could have gone. One of them is, gosh, how can I forget his name? Shakur Rashid. Yeah, Shakur Rashid. He's a guy who's good enough to be at an All-American level. I think he might have actually AA'd last year as well. But it sounds like he's probably not going to be ready to wrestle until second semester, so him being there might have just been more of a ruse, and they were just expecting the one guy who was their backup to go. And it sounds like that backup didn't go because there was an issue with skin check, so I don't know if he had ringworm or staph, but whatever the case may be, he didn't end up going out there to wrestle. So the number 1 team in the country doesn't have anyone out there to wrestle at 184 as a result. 6 points goes to Arizona State. Then you have the number 7 guy, Kyle Cannell, for Penn State, going up against an unranked guy in Cordell Norfleet at 197 pounds, and Norfleet gets the win here. Now, what's interesting about Kyle is that he hasn't really ever had that great of a regular season, but a couple of years ago, he did just enough in his conference tournament to get into the NCAA tournament and had a fantastic NCAA tournament, finishing 3rd. And so for that reason, he gets ranked pretty high, but it seems as though a guy who never really was that great in the regular season still isn't doing that great in this regular season. So for Penn State, they're going to have to figure out whether they think he's going to be a guy who's going to perform at his best in March, or if they just think he was an average wrestler who had a great tournament and that's it for him. And then at heavyweight, Anthony Cassar gets the win over Tanner Hall, but it wasn't enough. So Arizona State ends up winning 19-18. Next NCAA wrestling duel to talk about is Iowa versus Iowa State. Last year, this duel was within a point. Iowa State hasn't beaten Iowa in quite a long time, but after that really close duel last year, I think some people thought that there was a chance they could pull the upset here, especially with it being at home. First match of the evening, you have Spencer Lee versus Alex Mackel. Lee gets a tech fall in the first period. Last year, the same match, Lee I think was dealing with a flu, or was pretty sick at the time. So had a rough match. He still won by major decision, but looked really bad at the end of it. Next match we had Gavin Teasdale getting a pretty good, a pretty dominant win for Iowa, so a major decision there. Then at 41, Carter Happel was looking all right, but unfortunately for him, wasn't able to hang on and beat Parker, so Parker gets the win for Iowa State. Then 149, a bit of a controversial match between Pat Lugo and Jared Dagan. Dagan had a couple different times where it looked like he had done enough to steal the lead in the 3rd period, but the first time there was a penalty for locked hands right before he was able to turn Lugo and get him on his back. So that rather than getting the back points, he just loses a point for the locked hands, and then Lugo gets away. Dagan has a chance to take him down at the end and had the riding time point there as well, so he would have stolen the win there. But it looks as though he wasn't able to secure the takedown right as time expired. So Pat Lugo gets the win there in a match between the number 4 guy and the number 6 guy. Then at 157, a match that on paper you had number 2 versus number 19, but the reason why the guy who was number 19, David Carr, was 19 is because he's a freshman. I think a lot of people know he's a lot better than that. Very close match up until the end of it. Young had a takedown attempt early on where Carr was able to get out of bounds and didn't give up any points. But after that, Carr was the one who was getting closer on his takedown attempts. Eventually lands, I believe he had a cradle and was able to take down Caleb Young with that, and then also get some back points as well. So Carr gets a big win for him. And with him beating the number 2 guy, I'm sure he'll be in the top 10, if not the top 5, when next week's rankings come out. Alex Marinelli was then able to get a regular decision win for Iowa at 165. 174, Michael Kemmerer with a major decision. At 184, a bit of a surprise in that Nelson Brands, who, I mean, if he wanted to, I'm sure he could probably make 165 right now. He walks around, I think, at like 176. Doesn't really cut any weight. Ends up stepping in for Cash Wilkie, who is a top 10 guy for Iowa at 184, and actually fits the size. Wilkie had actually wrestled at 197 at one point for the Hawkeyes in their starting lineup. But Nelson Brands, unranked, comes in against the number 5 guy in the country and ends up pulling off an upset victory in overtime. Had a really quick take, kind of like a flash takedown where Colbray was briefly down, but it was enough to get him the 2 points, and then was able to hang on there in overtime and get the win. Then at 197, Jacob Warner with a dominant win, and at heavyweight, Tony Cassiope with another dominant win as well. Or not, well, it wasn't a major decision, but it was a pretty dominant win, I would say. He never really was that close to getting taken down and controlled most of the match, and once he was on top, stayed on top. So the next topic to talk about after that will be Gary Tonon versus Davi Ramos or Davi Ramos. Davi Ramos obviously is currently in the UFC right now, former ADCC champion. His last fight was against Islam Makhachev. It was a little bit unfortunate that a lot of people wanted to see that fight take place on the ground a little bit more than it did. But Makhachev kept the fight on the feet for the first 10 minutes, and then the final 5 didn't have him down after he had rocked him, but was very cautious and stayed out of trouble. For Gary Tonon, he's a guy who I believe is 5-0 right now, is pretty close to a title shot in 1, and a guy who I think a lot of people are going to want to see in the UFC at some point in his career. And that point may be relatively soon, especially if he's able to win a one world title really soon. So with this match, there was some thought where if Gary Tonon gets a dominant win over Davi Ramos, then it might be able to kind of build a case for him and get some more fans excited about the idea of him being in the UFC right now. He did win the match, but this was a match where both of them understood what the rule set was under fight to win. Fight to win doesn't give any points. It's just whoever is closer getting submissions pretty much. So it's just attack. So these guys were giving up position oftentimes, just attacking different leg locks, where they were trying to attack for different chokes. Position wasn't a concern for these guys. They were just trying to catch each other in other submissions. A lot of really cool attempts, but nothing was all that close up until the end when Gary Tonon had Davi Ramos' back and was trying to finish with a rear naked choke. But either way, it was a really exciting match to watch. But from an MMA standpoint, I don't know that we really learned anything new here as far as where either of the two stand. Couple more topics to get to. So we have that fight from 2017 where Mike Brown was able to pull up the footage of it, and his point that he made with it is like, this is why you never stop fighting until the ref pulls you off, and then yikes. And if you're watching the video version of the podcast, you can see the picture where the guy is tapping and the ref is on the other side. And I don't really take issue with what the ref was doing, because with a choke like this, especially with a buried head, it's better to be on the side where you're looking at the head, because then that way if the guy goes out, you'll know exactly when he goes out, or at least you'll know relatively closely to when he goes out. Because it's better to watch the head and get an idea of when the guy actually goes unconscious, and then to watch the hand. And if he never taps and then he goes out, then the hand never moves, and at that point you're like, oh, I guess he's still fine, even if he's already being choked unconscious. So I get why the ref was doing what he did there. He never sees the tap. Guy taps, the fighter with the guillotine ends up giving up the choke, as he should, because his opponent tapped. But then the guy on top just continues to fight, and then eventually ends up winning by TKO within the same round. Now, to me, obviously there's an issue here with the fighter who decided to keep fighting after he tapped out. There's definitely a lack of honor in that. But what surprises me is that when I saw this, after Mike Brown posted this, and he posted it this week on November 18th of 2019, is that this fight actually took place, I believe, in April of 2017. So quite a while ago. So I figured, okay, well, I'm sure they've at least gone back to the commission, reviewed the results, and they got it right? Apparently not. Apparently the guy who tapped out still has a win on his record for this fight, which makes absolutely no sense to me. But I guess as far as lessons are concerned from this, you kind of just have to take what Mike Brown said here and just say, hey, look, if you have a choke on someone, you got to make sure that the ref sees it before you let it go. And it's unfortunate that it worked out that way. I don't blame the fighter who let go of the choke, because typically when someone taps out, it's over. You would figure that someone's going to see it, and even if you figure no one else is going to see it, like when your opponent taps out, you figure they're at least going to have the honor in saying, hey, look, I did tap out. It did happen. So it's hard to really feel like the guy made a giant mistake there. I mean, obviously, if he has a chance to run it back, or if he could go back in time, knowing what he knows now, he would have held on until the ref saw the tap. He'd probably say, "Hey, ref, he's tapping." The ref would then move around from the head side to the hand side and be like, "Okay, you're right," and that'd be the end of the match. Um, but it's kind of tough for him there. It's tough for the ref, because in the ref's position, even if the guy lets go and then the other guy ends up on top and starts throwing punches, and while his opponent's saying, "Hey, he tapped," if you didn't see the tap, you can't really stop the fight and say, "Oh, okay, well, the guy told me he tapped. I guess he tapped then." Like, you kind of have to go with what you see. So for the ref, I understand why he was positioned where he was on the choke. I understand him allowing the fight to continue after the guy got up and continued to fight. It's just unfortunate that there wasn't a system in place where they could review it, and it's really unfortunate that the commission didn't go back and review it and give the one to the rightful winner here. And then for the guy who tapped and then continued fighting, I mean, good for you. Like, you got to win here, but you definitely sacrificed your dignity. And I think all your training partners and all the other people who are in the MMA scene out there in New England, knowing what you did, it's not worth it. It would have been better to take the loss than to do what he did. But hey, he got the win. Given that these guys were both making their pro debuts, I'm sure he probably made like a couple $100 there. So he's taking a couple $100 in exchange, losing his dignity, and I don't think that was really worth it for him. But that's what happened. Final thing to talk about here is from a jiu-jitsu match that happened last weekend. In jiu-jitsu, obviously, it's a grappling sport. If you punch someone in a grappling sport, you get DQ'd. That's typically the case. In this case, though, it was a submission-only tournament, open weight. So you had a guy in William Tackett, who I believe is around like 155, 170 pounds, going up against Tex Johnson, who's a heavyweight, probably like in the 220 range, if not higher. And the bigger guy, Tex Johnson, while he was going for a leg lock, Tackett ends up like, you could say kicking away was more of like a push with his foot. You're allowed to do that in jiu-jitsu. You're allowed to push away with your foot, especially in leg locks. It's oftentimes one of the better ways to defend them. So he does that. Then they reset to sort of like a neutral position, and Tex just throws a punch at him and just kind of like stares him down like, hey, what the hell was that about? And watching the replay, there was really nothing wrong with the kick, or nothing wrong with the push, I would say. But the punch was definitely wrong. The ref was kind of like, wait, what the hell just happened? And under... I mean, obviously, even under their rules, that should have been an immediate DQ. I think sometimes with a lot of tournaments that are smaller, whether it's like BJJ Fanatics just kind of running their own tournament, or even sometimes like some of the smaller tournaments, like the IBJJF has no problem DQing people, but some of these other tournaments really don't like DQing people. They just want to kind of let people fight through and just keep a match going. And in this case, the punch wasn't super hard. Tackett was fine and was able to keep going through, so they were like, you know what, just screw it, we'll keep going. It should have been a DQ. Unfortunately, it's an EBI match, so it goes to overtime, and then Tex is able to win by armbar in the EBI overtime. So even though he should have been DQ'd, he ends up winning, moving on, but ultimately doesn't make it to the finals, and I don't think got any money or won any prize money from this. But bit of an unfortunate situation. Now, what brought this up, though, was one of the guys from Flow Grappling, Howell Teague, or however it's pronounced, was saying that this was just like an awful breach of trust, that this should never happen in jiu-jitsu, that Tex should be basically disallowed from competing in any tournaments for like a year or so, if not more, that it was that bad. As far as how I see it, there's something that happens in wrestling and it happens in jiu-jitsu as well, which is, it's called a hard collar tie. So obviously a collar tie can be used to set up a takedown, but sometimes people just kind of throw a collar tie there and it's clear they're not using it to set up a takedown, they're just kind of using it to strike their opponent in the head. And to me, a lot of times those collar ties are a lot harder than this punch this punch right here. So to me, I don't like it when people use hard collar ties as a way to just kind of punch people in the face or to like strike people in the head. But I think most people in the jiu-jitsu community, when they see that, they aren't like, all right, well, if you excessively use hard collar ties, you shouldn't be allowed to compete. So to me, if that's the stand on collar ties, I don't know that Tex should really be looked at as like this awful villain for what he did. Even though what he did was clearly a punch and his hand was closed. definitely should have been DQ for this match. I think if you are running a tournament and you don't want to have issues where you're going to have a guy who's going to break rules or who's going to do things that you feel are detrimental to the sport, then I guess you could look at that and say, hey, maybe I don't want to bring Tex in. But to me, this isn't something that was like so awful that he needs to be like excommunicated from the sport. Like, yes, he should have been DQ'd from his match, but I don't really feel like it's one of those things where he should be just like kicked out of the sport or like kept from competing. It was bad, but I feel like a fair punishment here would be just a DQ for the one match, not anything really that substantial or something that lasts a whole lot longer than that. But that covers all the topics for this week. Thanksgiving's coming up next week. I'm not sure there's going to be any big stories that come, but you never know. It seems like things are happening all the time. So I'll cover whatever news there is on next week's podcast, and that'll be it.